You probably didn't see it coming the way it actually happened. At first, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt confusing, distant, almost like something slowly slipping through your hands without a clear moment where it broke. One day things felt normal enough, and then suddenly you were questioning everything. What you said, what you did, what went wrong. And the hardest part is this. You kept trying to fix something that was already being quietly dismantled. You weren't the problem. That's not something people say just to make you feel better. It's something you need to understand clearly. What you experienced wasn't a normal relationship breakdown. It was a controlled, emotionally imbalanced dynamic where the ending wasn't mutual, it was managed. When a narcissistic woman ends a relationship, she rarely does it in a direct, clean, emotionally responsible way. Instead, she uses a series of subtle but deeply damaging tactics that leave you feeling confused, rejected, and emotionally drained. Not because you failed, but because that confusion keeps her in control, even at the end. The first thing that usually happens is emotional withdrawal that feels gradual but intentional. At the beginning, she was attentive, engaged, present. You felt seen, maybe even deeply understood. But as the relationship moved forward, something shifted. Conversations became shorter, her tone changed, the warmth started disappearing. And you noticed it. But when you tried to address it, you were met with vagueness. "I'm just tired. You're overthinking. Nothing's wrong." So you started adjusting. You became more careful, more accommodating. You tried to bring things back to how they were before. What you didn't realize is that this wasn't random distance. It was a slow detachment process. Psychologically, this happens because once she feels she has secured your emotional investment, she no longer needs to maintain the same level of effort. The connection becomes less about mutual care and more about control. And as she pulls back, you lean in more. That imbalance creates a quiet dependency. You begin to chase clarity, reassurance, and emotional stability, things that were once freely given but are now being withheld. And over time, that alone starts to break you down. Then comes something even more destabilizing, subtle devaluation. It's not always obvious. It doesn't always come as direct insults. Instead, it shows up in small dismissals, a change in how she responds to you, less appreciation, more criticism disguised as honesty. You start hearing things like, "You're too sensitive," or "You always make things a big deal," or "You've changed." And slowly, your confidence begins to shift. You start questioning your reactions. You second-guess your emotions. You wonder if you're asking for too much, even when your needs are completely reasonable. This tactic works because it alters your internal sense of reality. Instead of seeing the relationship clearly, you begin to see yourself as the source of the problem. From a psychological standpoint, this is about preserving her self-image. A narcissistic personality struggles with accountability. So rather than acknowledging her emotional withdrawal, she redirects the focus onto your perceived flaws. And the effect on you is deep. You don't just feel hurt, you feel unstable. You lose your sense of emotional ground. And that makes you even more likely to stay, to try harder, to prove your worth. The third tactic is where things often become most confusing: intermittent reinforcement. This is one of the most powerful forms of emotional manipulation. After periods of distance and coldness, she suddenly becomes warm again, attentive, kind, almost like the person you first connected with. And for a moment, everything feels okay. You feel relief. You feel hope. You think maybe things are improving. But then, just as quickly, that warmth disappears again, and the cycle repeats. This creates an emotional loop where you become attached not to consistency, but to the possibility of getting that version of her back. Psychologically, this works the same way addictive patterns work. Your brain starts chasing those positive moments because they're unpredictable and rare. And over time, you become conditioned to tolerate the negative in order to experience the positive. This isn't love. It's a reward system that keeps you emotionally hooked. And the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to step away. Because you're not just losing the relationship, you're losing the version of it that gave you hope. Then comes the shift toward blame and justification. When the relationship gets closer to ending, she begins to create a narrative. And in that narrative, you become the reason things didn't work. She may say things like, "I just don't feel the same anymore," or "You've been too much lately," or "This isn't healthy for me." On the surface, these statements sound reasonable, but in context, they ignore everything that led up to this point. They erase her behavior, her withdrawal, her inconsistency, and instead, they place the weight of the ending on you. This is not an honest reflection. It's a protective strategy. By framing the breakup this way, she avoids guilt and maintains control over how the story is told, both to you and to others. And for you, this creates a deep sense of confusion, because you remember the effort you put in. You remember trying to communicate, trying to understand, trying to fix things. But now, you're left wondering if you were actually the one who caused the damage. This is where many people get stuck. They replay the relationship over and over, trying to find where they went wrong. But the truth is, the outcome was shaped long before the ending. The final tactic is often the most painful, the discard that feels sudden but was actually prepared. From your perspective, it may feel like everything collapsed quickly. One conversation, one moment, and it's over. But in reality, she had already emotionally exited the relationship long before that point. And sometimes, there's already someone else involved. This isn't always about love or connection. It's about maintaining a sense of control and validation. When she feels that the current dynamic no longer serves her needs, she shifts her attention elsewhere, while still keeping you emotionally engaged until she's ready to leave. So when the discard happens, it feels abrupt to you. But to her, it's already been processed. And that difference in timing is what makes it so painful. You're still trying to understand what's happening while she's already moved on. That gap creates a sense of shock, of emotional whiplash. You're left holding unanswered questions while she appears unaffected. And that can make you feel like the entire relationship wasn't real. But it was real, for you. Your feelings were genuine. Your effort was real. Your attachment was real. What wasn't real was the balance. What wasn't real was the consistency. And once you start to see that clearly, something begins to shift. You stop asking, why wasn't I enough? And you start asking, why was I trying to earn something that should have been mutual? That's where awareness begins. Not in blaming her and not in blaming yourself, but in recognizing the pattern. You begin to see how the emotional withdrawal, the subtle devaluation, the inconsistency, the blame, and the final discard all connect. They're not random events. They're part of a dynamic that revolves around control, not connection. And once you see that, you can start stepping back. Not emotionally reacting to every memory or every question, but observing it with more clarity. You realize that the confusion you felt wasn't because you were incapable of understanding. It's because the situation itself was unclear by design. And with that realization, something important happens. You begin to detach, not in a cold or angry way, but in a grounded, steady way. You stop chasing answers that were never meant to be given. You stop trying to fix a version of the relationship that only existed temporarily. And instead, you start focusing on yourself, on rebuilding your sense of stability, on reconnecting with your own needs, your own boundaries, your own sense of worth. Because one of the biggest effects of this kind of relationship is that it pulls you away from yourself. You become focused on managing the other person's emotions, anticipating their reactions, adjusting your behavior. And in that process, you lose touch with your own center. Healing is about returning to that center. It's about recognizing that your needs are not excessive, that consistency is not too much to ask for, that clarity is not something you should have to chase. And as you begin to rebuild that understanding, your perspective changes. You don't just see the relationship differently, you see yourself differently. You see the strength it took to stay, to care, to try. But you also see the importance of not abandoning yourself in the process. That's where boundaries come in, not as a reaction, but as a decision. A decision to no longer accept emotional inconsistency as normal. A decision to walk away from dynamics that require you to constantly prove your value. A decision to protect your energy, your time, your emotional space. And those boundaries don't need to be loud or dramatic. They can be quiet and firm. They can look like choosing not to engage in conversations that pull you back into confusion. They can look like not responding to messages that reopen old wounds. They can look like accepting that closure doesn't always come from the other person. It comes from your own understanding. And as you continue to move forward, something else begins to settle in. Peace. Not the kind that comes from everything being resolved perfectly, but the kind that comes from no longer being in the middle of that emotional instability. You start to feel more grounded, more clear, more in control of your own emotional state. And that doesn't mean you forget what happened. It means it no longer controls you. The memories lose their intensity, the questions lose their urgency, and you begin to create a different kind of relationship with yourself, one that is stable, consistent, and honest. Because in the end, what you went through wasn't just about losing someone. It was about learning to recognize what real connection should feel like. It should feel steady. It should feel mutual. It should not leave you constantly questioning your worth. And once you understand that, you don't just move on, you move forward with clarity. Stronger, not because of what happened, but because of what you now understand. And that understanding is what protects you. Not from ever feeling pain again, but from staying in situations that slowly take you away from yourself. You don't need to chase clarity anymore. You have it. And from here, you get to build something different, something real, something that doesn't require you to lose yourself just to keep it.